My name is Maya Vance. I'm 26 years old and I'm a licensed structural engineer in Seattle, Washington. I work for a mid-sized firm off Westlake Avenue, the kind of job where you spend your lunch breaks staring at load calculations and your evenings learning that the most dangerous structures in the world aren't bridges or buildings. They're the ones nobody puts in a blueprint, the ones your family builds around you while you're still living inside them. 4 years ago, I stopped sending money home to Dayton, Ohio. Not because I ran out, not because I forgot, because I finally did the math on what I'd been paying for and what I'd been paying with. And the number didn't add up to love. It added up to a job I'd never applied for, a debt I'd never agreed to, and a family that had decided my silence was cheaper than my honesty. When I stopped, they didn't call to ask if I was okay. They called everyone else. Aunts in Columbus, cousins in Cincinnati, my parents' pastor on Springboro Pike, and the story they told every one of them was the same. Maya disappeared. Their daughter just vanished one day, just stopped answering, just abandoned her family without a word. They told that story for 4 years. 4 years of holiday dinners I wasn't at. 4 years of my name becoming a wound people passed around the table with the sweet potatoes. 4 years of my mother answering, "How is Maya?" with a look that said the question itself was cruel. 4 years. And then my brother Ethan knocked on my apartment door on a Thursday in November, in the rain, sent to find me. He knocked. I opened. He looked past me into my apartment, and the color drained out of his face like a man who just realized the ghost he was chasing was never a ghost at all. He backed down the steps, phone at his ear, and I heard him say it clearly in the November air, "Mom, you need to see this. She never told us." What he saw behind me that afternoon is the reason I'm telling this story, and what my parents did with what he saw. That's the reason they'll never tell it the same way again. If this story's landing somewhere real for you, drop a comment below and subscribe. This channel is for the quiet ones who've been paying for things that were never supposed to cost this much. And this story is one of theirs. You need to know who I was before Dayton, because Maya disappeared only makes sense if you understand who Maya was while she was still there. I grew up in a pale yellow house on Crestview Drive in Dayton, Ohio, 3 miles from the airport, close enough that the windows rattled on a bad weather day. My dad, Richard Vance, worked quality assurance at a packaging plant in Moraine. My mother, Eleanor Vance, did bookkeeping part-time for a dental office on Wilmington Pike and spent the rest of her time managing the particular project of our family with the intensity of a woman who had decided that what she couldn't control on the outside, she would absolutely control at home. I was the middle child. Ethan is 4 years older. My younger sister Paige is 22 now, and she was 16 when all of this started. In my family, the money rule was unspoken but absolute. If you earned it, it was everyone's. Not stated at the dinner table, not written into any agreement, but as reliable as gravity. When I got my first job at 17, a hostess position at an Applebee's on Far Hills Avenue, I started handing my mother $60 every Friday without being asked, because the one time I didn't, the silence in that house lasted 3 weeks. That's a long time to eat dinner in a room where nobody will meet your eyes. By the time I graduated from Wright State with an engineering degree, scholarships, work study, 2 part-time jobs, 4 years of ramen and campus library nights, I understood that achievement in my family had a tithe attached to it. You got smarter, you made more, and more came back to the house on Crestview Drive. My first real job was in Columbus. I was 22, making $47,000 a year, living in a 1-bedroom apartment on Lane Avenue. I sent $300 home every month because my mother cried on the phone once and said they were behind on the second car payment and I was the only one in a position to help. She said it exactly that way. "You're the only one in a position to help," which sounds like a compliment until you hear it enough times to understand what it's actually measuring. Ethan wasn't in a position to help. Ethan was 35 miles away in Kettering with a job at a logistics company and a girlfriend who later became his wife, and he was never once called while a car payment was late. I know this because Ethan told me himself, years later, when he was standing in the rain outside my apartment with a face I'd never seen on him before. By the time I was 23, I was sending $400 a month. The reason changed each time. Dad's truck needed rotors. The furnace was making a noise. Paige needed money for her junior class trip. Each reason was plausible. None of them were the real reason, which I eventually understood was simply that I was available and I hadn't said no yet. And in my family's economy, a person who has never said no doesn't actually get to have their own budget. And here's the thing that kept me paying long after. I should have looked at that column of numbers and called it what it was. Being needed felt close enough to being loved that I kept confusing the two. A decade of nights in hospital waiting rooms and holiday drives and emergency wire transfers had built up an identity in my chest, the capable one, the responsible one, the one who handles it. And I was terrified that if I stopped handling it, I'd stop mattering. That's the real architecture of what I was living in. Not a family that needed money, a family that needed me to need them to need me. The Seattle offer came when I was 24, a structural engineering firm with a project pipeline that made my hands shake when I read the job description. Real infrastructure work, a salary that more than doubled what I was making in Columbus. Benefits, relocation, a signing bonus that sat in my bank account for 3 weeks before I told anyone about it because I already knew what telling would cost. I took the job in April. I told my parents in March. And the dinner that followed is the one I measure all other bad conversations against because it lasted 4 hours, and none of those hours were about me. My mother cried. Not the soft kind, the kind with a catalog behind it, every sacrifice she'd ever made for us, everything she'd gone without, how this family stays together, how far Seattle was, how she'd always known I thought I was better than them. My father said very little, which is its own kind of loudness. Ethan wasn't there. Paige sat at the kitchen table eating cereal and watching our mother perform with the detached focus of a teenager who has clocked this show so many times. She's lost the ability to be surprised by it. Before I left the table, my mother told me I would need to increase the monthly transfer while I got settled, because the adjustment period would be hard on the family. She said adjustment period the way you'd say recovery time, like my moving away was a surgery she had to survive. I said I'd see what I could do. I moved to Seattle in May. I found an apartment in Capitol Hill, second floor of an older brick building on Olive Way, east-facing windows, a coffee shop on the corner that I went to every morning like it was a prescription. The Pacific Northwest did something to me that I hadn't expected. It gave me room, physical room, yes. The sky out there is different, bigger somehow, even in the gray months, but also the room that comes from not being the person on Crestview Drive who holds everything together. I could walk to work, I could sit in a restaurant alone on a Tuesday, and not have my phone light up with a need before the appetizer arrived. For 3 months, I sent the money. 400, then 5 when my mother mentioned the water heater. Then in August, I got a call at 10:30 on a Wednesday night from my mother, and she was crying before she finished saying my name. And she needed $1,800 by Friday because Richard had a medical bill from a procedure in July that the insurance had partially denied. She'd been managing it, she said. She hadn't wanted to worry me. She'd held it as long as she could. I sent the 1,800. I was 24, 3 months into a new city, furnishing a new apartment on a reduced savings account, because relocation costs are never as covered as the offer letter implies. But I sent it because what kind of person doesn't send it? What kind of daughter lets her father's medical bill go to collections? The kind who can read a billing statement, as it turned out. I asked my mother to send me a copy. Old habit from engineering. I like to see the original document. She sent it. The bill was from a dermatology practice. The procedure was a cosmetic consultation. The insurance denial was standard for elective services. My father was not sick. My father had gone to a dermatologist about something on his nose and decided not to pay the bill himself when he had a daughter in Seattle with a new salary and a demonstrated willingness to cover gaps. I didn't call that night. I sat with the billing statement at my kitchen table on Olive Way and looked at it the way you look at a crack in a load-bearing wall, not panicking, calculating. I opened a spreadsheet. I am an engineer. Spreadsheets are my native language. And for the next 3 hours, I did something I had been unconsciously avoiding for my entire working life. I tracked every dollar. Columbus rent, Columbus groceries, Columbus utilities, minus every transfer home. The math came out to this. In 2 years of working, I had sent my parents just over $14,000. $14,000 through a mix of monthly transfers and one-time emergencies, each one justified by a reason I'd been handed and accepted without asking to see the paperwork. Each reason plausible. None of them, when I examined them from Seattle with adult eyes and access to Google, entirely what they'd been described as. I did not call my mother. I did not send another transfer. I just sat with the spreadsheet. And that Monday, I opened a separate savings account at a bank my parents didn't know about. And I started paying myself what I'd been paying them. The silence started immediately. Not my silence. I called the next Sunday, the way I always called on Sundays. I asked about the week. I asked about Paige. I did not mention the transfer, and neither did my mother, which told me everything I needed to know about how the transfers had been working. They stopped when I stopped paying attention to them, and the expectation had become automatic enough that acknowledging it out loud would have required naming what it was. The following month, October, my mother called on the first of the month instead of the Sunday and asked when I was planning to send the rent help. I said I wasn't. This month, things were tight. She asked what I meant by tight. I said I was working through some expenses. She went quiet for 11 seconds. I counted, and then she said, "Well, I suppose we'll manage." In the voice that means nobody will manage, and everything that doesn't get managed will find its way back to me eventually. November, no transfer. December, no transfer. Christmas came, and I didn't fly home because flights from Seattle to Dayton in December cost what they cost. And I had started, for the first time in my adult life, keeping money in an account that was mine alone, and spending it felt like sacrilege. I called on Christmas morning. My mother answered and said it was fine that I wasn't there. She said fine twice, in the same sentence, which is never fine. January, my Aunt Roberta called from Columbus. She'd heard I was having trouble and just wanted to check in. I said I wasn't having trouble. She said my mother was worried. I said there was nothing to worry about. Roberta said, "Maya, honey, your mama says you've gone through some kind of change." I thanked her for calling, and we talked about her garden for 10 minutes, and I hung up and added Roberta, January 14th, to a notes document I had started keeping. Old habit, engineer's document. By February, the story had been curated. I know this because a family friend, a woman named Greta, who had known my parents since before I was born and who reached me through Facebook, sent me a message asking if I was okay, because she'd heard I had pulled away from the family after a difficult year. I wrote back that I was fine and working and living in Seattle, and she replied with a red heart emoji and something about family being everything. I had not pulled away. I had stopped sending money. In my family, those were the same thing. And that distinction, the fact that nobody, not Roberta, not Greta, not my mother's pastor who left a voicemail in March, nobody ever asked what actually happened. That's the part that tells the whole story. The version that traveled through Dayton wasn't Maya stopped sending money after we asked for $1,800 for a dermatologist bill, and she finally read the receipt. The version was Maya disappeared. It's a better story. It makes a better wound. A daughter who disappeared is a tragedy. A daughter who stopped paying is an inconvenience with a paper trail. I chose not to correct the story. At the time, I thought I was choosing peace. I understand now that I was buying time, and the time was worth more than I knew. Seattle rewired me. That's the only word that works, and it's the right word for an engineer. I'm not talking about self-help retreats or therapy breakthroughs. Though I did start seeing a therapist named Dr. Calloway on Capitol Hill every other Thursday, and she was the first person who ever asked me to describe what I got out of the transfers besides guilt. The answer I gave her the first time was wrong. The second time, it was closer. The third time, I finally said, I got to believe they needed me. And if they needed me, I wasn't expendable. She wrote something in her notebook. She didn't show me what. What Seattle actually gave me was scale. I was working on real projects. A pedestrian bridge designed for a municipal project in Bellevue, a load analysis for a building addition on First Hill, work that would exist in 3 dimensions and stand up to wind and weight and time. Work with my name in the engineering documents as the signatory professional. I was making decisions that mattered, and I was being trusted with them, not because I was the reliable one in a family system that needed someone reliable, but because I had the license and the competence and the demonstrated judgment. I started building things outside work too. Not literally, not at first, but the habits of a builder. I started documenting things. The notes document grew. I kept my bank statements organized by year in a folder labeled Personal on my laptop, with tabs going back to my first Columbus paycheck. I tracked every old transfer. I had the confirmation numbers from the wire services, the screenshots of my mother's texts asking for help, all of it filed with the quiet meticulousness of someone who suspects they might need it someday and wants to be ready. By the end of my first full year in Seattle, I had also done something that took longer to do than I'd expected. I had made friends, real ones. Not the colleagues who share lunch variety, though I had those too. I mean Priya, who I met in a rock climbing gym on Eastlake, and who is a patent attorney and who once looked at a text my mother had sent me and said, with no drama, "That's a money demand dressed as concern." And I nearly fell off the climbing wall because I had never heard anyone say it that plainly. I mean Corinne, who grew up in a similar family system in Birmingham and who had been estranged from her parents for 6 years, and who was, to my continuous amazement, completely okay. Not broken, not riddled with guilt. Okay. She had built a life on Olive Way, 6 blocks from mine, and she paid her own rent, and she had a jade plant in her kitchen window. And she was fine. She was more than fine. I had been operating under the assumption that cutting the money off meant cutting everything off, and that cutting everything off meant becoming a person without a family, and that becoming a person without a family meant becoming a person without an identity. Corinne was the evidence that this was wrong. You can build one. It's slower. It's quieter. It doesn't have the heft of a family origin story or the warmth of shared holidays or the specific gravity of your mother saying your name the way only your mother can. But it holds weight. It's load-bearing if you build it right. I started building it right. I got better at my job. By year 2 in Seattle, I had a project credit on a municipal infrastructure report that went to the city council. I took a weekend certification course in advanced seismic design because Seattle sits on a fault and the buildings here have to be humble about that. I ran 2 miles every morning along the lake before the city woke up. I learned to cook real food slowly, badly at first, then better. I bought furniture that I chose myself, from places I picked myself, with money I had kept myself, and I owned every piece of it in a way I had never owned anything in my parents' house, where everything was ours until it needed paying for, at which point it became mine. I was 26 years old, 1 month before Ethan knocked on my door, the day my lease renewal came. And I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and signed it without calling anyone to ask if it was okay. That was the whole victory. That one signature. Mine. The knock came on a Thursday in November, 8:15 in the evening. I was on my couch with the structural analysis open on my laptop and rain against every window, which in Seattle in November is the standard condition, and I had learned to find it beautiful. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. Not my neighbor's pattern. I opened the door. Ethan. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, holding his car keys in his right hand, like he hadn't decided yet whether he was staying. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, which was before I left for Seattle at a family dinner that ended with our mother crying and our father saying almost nothing, and Paige eating cereal. He'd put on a little weight. His hairline had done the thing our father's hairline does. He looked like a Vance, is what I mean. He looked like home, except that home had never been entirely safe, and neither was this moment. Maya? That was the first thing he said. Just my name. Ethan. Just his. He looked at me, then past me. And his face did the thing I will think about for the rest of my life. Behind me was my apartment, Capitol Hill, second floor, the east-facing windows now dark with rain and city light. The furniture I'd chosen, a navy couch from a furniture store on Pine Street, a coffee table that used to be a cable spool that I found at an estate sale in Fremont and sanded myself on a Saturday, bookshelves I'd built from lumber and pipe brackets and filled with engineering references and novels, and 3 years of a life I'd assembled piece by piece. On the kitchen counter, a jade plant Corinne had given me and which I had kept alive for 18 months, which felt like proof of something. On the wall, a framed print I'd bought from a street vendor at Pike Place Market, a topographic map of the Cascades. On my desk, the project files for the Bellevue Bridge. Open, my laptop, my coffee mug with a Wright State logo, the one thing I'd kept from Ohio that still made me smile. He looked at all of it, and the color went out of his face. Not the color of guilt, the color of recalibration, the particular gray that comes over a person when the story they've been given has just been replaced by a fact, and the fact is so much bigger than the story that they need a moment to let the size of it land. He took one step back, then another. The phone came up. Mom, you need to see this. She never told us. I stood in the doorway and let him make the call. I did not speak. I did not move. I waited, the way I have always been best at waiting, with the steadiness of someone who has already done the math and knows how this scene resolves. He hung up, stood there. Then he said, "Can I come in?" I said yes. We sat at the cable spool coffee table and I made tea. Because that's what I do when I need my hands to have a job. And my brother talked. He told me what they had said, all of it. The version that had been running in Dayton for 4 years, Maya had a breakdown, Maya got into a relationship that isolated her. Maya had some kind of episode and stopped answering her phone. Maya, in one particularly creative telling our Aunt Roberta had apparently delivered at a 4th of July cookout, had gone off the grid in Seattle and they didn't know if she was even okay. I wasn't off the grid. I had the same phone number I'd had for 6 years. I had a professional email on a firm website. I was licensed by the state of Washington. My name was in the engineering documents on a municipal bridge project. I was not missing. I was a structural engineer on Westlake Avenue who had stopped sending $400 a month to a house in Dayton where nobody ever asked to see a receipt. Ethan said, "They said you stopped answering." I said, "Pull up your text from me right now. Go back 4 years." He looked at his phone. He scrolled. He found exactly what I knew he'd find. Nothing. Not one text from him in 4 years, not one. The last message between us was from the week before I moved to Seattle. He had wished me luck. I had said thank you. And then 4 years of silence, and none of it was mine. "Why didn't you reach out?" I asked him. Not angry, genuinely asking. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Mom said you weren't responding to anyone. Said it would just make it worse to pressure you." Ethan, my brother, the one person in my family I had genuinely missed, had been managed carefully into not contacting me and presented with a story of my unreachability that explained the silence without requiring anyone to examine who had actually gone quiet. "I need to show you something," I said. I went to my desk. I opened my laptop. I opened the folder. The folder was 3 years of documentation, and I want to be accurate about what I mean by that. I mean the spreadsheet with every transfer, dated amounts, the wire confirmation numbers, the screenshots of the text messages that preceded each one. I mean the copy of the dermatology bill my mother had forwarded me. The bill for the consultation my father didn't tell her wasn't medically necessary until I asked. I mean the notes document, chronological, every contact from a family friend or relative, asking about my well-being. Every message routed through a third party rather than directly to me. Every carefully worded Facebook message from someone my parents had clearly briefed. I mean 2 years of my own financial statements showing what I had built since the transfers stopped. The savings account my parents didn't know about, now holding $38,000. The retirement contributions, the professional license, the project credits. I am an engineer. I was trained to document because documentation is what stands up when memory doesn't. I walked Ethan through it the way I would walk a colleague through a load analysis. No drama, no raised voice, item by item with the original source material right there on the screen. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, what he said was, "She said you ghosted them." "I stopped sending money," I said. And then I stopped responding to the people they sent to ask why I stopped sending money. Because none of those people asked me directly, and none of them had information. And I decided that explaining myself to a relay system was not a conversation I wanted to have. "I didn't know about the money," he said. And here is the thing. I believed him. I believe him still. Ethan was not involved in the transfers. He'd never been asked to contribute. The system had been built around me specifically, and he'd lived his adult life entirely outside of it, which was its own kind of data. Not because he was favored. I don't think it was that simple. Because I was the one who had never said no, and he had said no, probably without ever knowing it needed to be said, simply by living his life at enough distance that it never became a question. "What are you going to do?" he said. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Not an attack, a real question, because he was the one who just called our mother. He was the one who would go back to Dayton. He was the one who'd been standing in between. He was quiet. Outside, the rain on Olive Way had gotten serious about itself. I could hear it from the kitchen. I think, he said slowly, that I've been an accessory to something I didn't know I was an accessory to, and I don't know exactly what that means yet. That was honest. That was more honest than I expected, and I told him so. Here is what happened when Ethan went back. He didn't do it my way. I want to be clear about that. He didn't go home and stage a dinner table moment or build a folder of his own. Ethan is not a builder. He's a talker, and what he did was he talked, which in this case was exactly the right tool for the job. He went to Dayton, and he sat across from our parents at the same kitchen table on Crestview Drive, and he told them what he'd seen. Not the apartment, or not just the apartment, the documentation. He'd taken pictures of several of the spreadsheet pages before he left. He showed them the transfer totals. He showed them the texts. He showed them the dermatology bill. I know what happened next because Ethan called me afterward and talked for 45 minutes. And I have him on a recorded voicemail because I asked his permission to record our calls. And he said yes, because Ethan is 4 years older and smarter about some things than our parents ever gave him credit for. My mother, according to Ethan, cried. Real tears. The kind she produces when the performance has shifted into crisis management. She said she hadn't realized how much it had added up to. She said it wasn't supposed to be that way. She said she loved me. She said Maya knows we love her at least 3 times, which is a thing people say when they're not sure it's true and are hoping repetition makes it load-bearing. My father said almost nothing. My father has said almost nothing in every version of every story in our family's history. And I have stopped waiting for him to be the kind of man who finds his voice in the difficult moments, because some people simply aren't that, and the waiting costs more than the speaking would. Then my mother said the thing that answered every question I'd had for 4 years. She said, if she had a problem with it, she should have said something. Ethan told her what I'd said on the phone in October of that first year, when the transfers stopped, that things were tight. She said that wasn't a reason. He told her that I'd answered every direct communication I'd received, that I hadn't vanished, that my number was the same and my email was the same, and my firm's website had been publicly accessible for 3 years with my name on it. She said Maya should have reached out. He showed her his own texts, 4 years of silence coming from his phone, not mine. She said she hadn't wanted to put him in the middle. She had put him in the middle to come find me. She had not wanted to put him in the middle to have an honest conversation. The distinction was not lost on him. He told me later that this was the moment he understood something he didn't have words for yet, and that he was still working it out. I told him that was fine. That's the kind of thing that takes as long as it takes. The story that my parents had been telling for 4 years did not die immediately. Stories that old don't. They have roots in all the people who've been watering them. Roberta, Greta, the pastor on Springboro Pike, the 4th of July cookout audience who heard about Maya going off the grid. You can't walk into all those kitchens and retract the version. What you can do is stop maintaining it. My mother stopped talking about me at church. That's what Ethan reported. She stopped saying my name in contexts designed to generate sympathy. She still hasn't called me to say she's sorry, and I'm not holding space for that call anymore. I used to. I held a lot of space for a lot of calls that never came, and the holding cost me things I'd rather have spent differently. But here is what actually happened. The thing that Ethan's visit and Ethan's conversation in that Dayton kitchen set off, which I could not have planned and would not have staged because it was better than anything I would have designed. Paige called me, my little sister, 22 years old and working a hostess job at a restaurant in Centerville while taking nursing prerequisite courses at Sinclair Community College, living at home because rent in Dayton is not cheap on a hostess income and nursing school is expensive. She called me on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks after Ethan's visit, while I was on my morning run along the lake. I answered because it was Paige, and Paige had never been part of the system. She'd been the audience, the kid eating cereal, the one young enough to watch it happen without the leverage to do anything about it. She said, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. The month I stopped sending money, October of my first year in Seattle, my mother had sat Paige down at the kitchen table and told her that Maya was going through a hard time and they needed to be patient with her. But it was also important that Paige understand that she was now the one who would need to step up for the family once she started working full-time. Paige was 18. She'd heard this, and she'd understood it in the way an 18-year-old understands anything an authority figure says, as information about how the world works, not as information about a pattern she was being recruited into. She told me that she'd given her mother $300 last month from her hostess tips because her father's truck needed a part and they were short. I sat down on a bench along the lakeshore and looked at the water for a moment. Paige, I said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not for me, for yourself. She said, okay. When you handed Mom that $300, did she ask you where it was coming from? Whether you could afford it? Whether it would affect your school savings? Silence. No, she said finally. What did she say? Another pause. She said the family always takes care of its own. The water was doing what Puget Sound does in November, gray and flat and serious, and I sat on that bench and I made a decision that I want to be honest with you about, because it wasn't clean, and it wasn't simple, and I'm not going to tell you it was purely noble. Part of it was protective. I did not want my little sister to spend 8 years being extracted from, the way I had been before she found her way to a spreadsheet and a separate savings account and a city 3 time zones away. Part of it was something else, something older and less tidy. Because 4 years of Maya Disappeared had been running on Crestview Drive and in Roberta's dining room and at 4th of July cookouts. And Paige was the last person in my family who didn't know what was actually in that folder. And there is a kind of accounting that only closes when the right person sees the numbers. I want to send you something, I said. Not money, documents. Can I do that? I sent Paige the folder, all of it. The spreadsheet, the text, the billing statement from the dermatology practice, the notes document, the 2 years of my own bank statements showing the savings account that had grown because I'd stopped sending transfers. I sent her a screen capture of the firm's website with my name in the engineer credits section. I sent her a photograph of my apartment on a Sunday morning, coffee on the cable spool table, jade plant in the window, Cascade topographic map on the wall. And then I sent her something I'd never sent anyone. A breakdown of what $14,000, invested instead of transferred, would be worth over 10 years at a conservative rate of return. I am a structural engineer, not a financial planner, but I can do math, and I wanted her to understand in concrete terms what the family always takes care of its own had cost the person it was said to. She read it over 2 days. I know, because she sent me one text after the first day. Okay, I need a minute, and called me on the second. I'm not sending any more money, she said. I said, that's your decision. Make it for yourself, not for me. She said, no, I mean, I already told her. I told Mom this morning that I'm not giving her money for my tips anymore because I'm saving it for school. I asked what happened. She cried, Paige said. And then after a pause, and then she said, I'd been talking to you. I said yes, she had been. And Mom said you'd put this in my head. Did she? I said, yeah. A long breath. I told her it was already in my head. I just didn't have the right words for it until now. My little sister, 22 years old, sitting in the kitchen on Crestview Drive with $300 of tip money back in her own pocket and a spreadsheet on her phone and a vocabulary she'd borrowed from mine. That's the image I've thought about most in the month since. That kitchen I grew up in, that table, that sentence. I just didn't have the right words for it until now. I called my mother 6 weeks after Ethan's visit. Not because I had to, because I had decided to. And deciding was the point. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was careful, the way voices get careful when the person holding the phone knows a conversation is happening that cannot be managed back to normal. I told her I wasn't going to recite the folder. She knew what was in it. Ethan had seen to that, and I'd sent Paige a copy, and my mother knew that too. I told her I wasn't calling to have a fight. because fighting required me to want something she was capable of giving. And what I actually wanted was something she'd never been able to offer, which was a version of the family where being loved didn't cost me my savings account. I told her that I was not coming home for Christmas, that this was not because I was disappearing, that my phone number would remain the same, my email would remain the same, my license would remain on the Washington State Licensing Board's public database, and if anyone wanted to find me, I was findable. I told her that Paige's nursing school savings were not a family resource, and then I told her the one thing I had rehearsed, not for drama, but because I needed to say it once, out loud, to the person it was about. You told people I disappeared, I said. For 4 years, the story was that I vanished. I didn't vanish. I stopped paying. Those are different things. And the fact that you made them the same thing tells me more about the system than you ever said directly. I'm not angry anymore, but I'm not going to keep my mouth shut about it, and I'm not going to let Paige grow up inside the same accounting. My mother was quiet. Then she said, I didn't think of it as paying. And honestly, that was the most honest thing she ever said to me about any of it, because she didn't. She genuinely didn't. The family always takes care of its own was a creed she'd inherited from somewhere before us, learned in some kitchen I'd never seen, from some version of the same system running a generation back. She didn't think of it as extraction because she'd never been taught to call it that. She thought of it as love. She thought the most loving thing I could do was to be available, and the most hurtful thing was to stop being available. And the story she told, Maya disappeared, was just her version of that hurt, shaped into a form the world around her could receive. Understanding that didn't change the numbers, but it changed the temperature of the thing. I know, I said, but that's what it was. She didn't answer. I could hear the Crestview Drive kitchen in the background, the specific hum of the refrigerator I'd grown up with, the sound of a house where everything is someone's except the parts that get used up. I said, I'll call on New Year's. If you want to talk, I'll talk. But if the call is about money or about where I went wrong, I'll say goodbye and we'll try again some other time. I hung up, sat with my tea going cold on the cable spool table, the jade plant in the window, rain on Olive Way. New Year's Day, I called. We talked for 22 minutes about her garden, about Paige's nursing school applications, about a trip my father wanted to take to visit a college friend in Nashville. She did not mention money. She did not mention the transfers. She asked once if I was happy in Seattle, and I said yes. She said, good. Just that. One word. It's not a fixed thing. It's not a healed thing. It is a true thing. And true things hold more weight than comfortable ones. And that's what I've learned to build for. Ethan and I text now. Not constantly, not the way siblings do in movies, but on a Wednesday sometimes, or when something happens at work I want to tell someone who would get it, or when he hears something funny about Paige's nursing school applications. The kind of texts that don't require anything, the kind that exists without a price tag. Paige is enrolled for spring semester. She's keeping her tip money. She called me last week to ask what a Roth IRA was, and I spent 40 minutes explaining it, and she was taking notes. And somewhere in the middle of it, she said, you're kind of a nerd. And I said, yes, that was accurate. And she laughed, and it was the cleanest sound I'd heard all month. The savings account has cleared $45,000. The jade plant is still alive. The Cascade topographic map is still on the wall. My name is in the engineering documents on a municipal bridge project, the pedestrian span in Bellevue, scheduled to open in 18 months. Real infrastructure, real load. My signature as the signatory professional. A thing that will stand up to wind and weight and time and won't ask anything of me but the work. I run 2 miles every morning along the lake before the city wakes up. And some mornings in November, the water is absolutely still. And the sky is just beginning to make up its mind about being light. And I think about the house on Crestview Drive, and the word disappeared, and the $14,000, and the dermatology bill. And I think about Ethan backing down my front steps with his phone at his ear, and Paige with her nursing school notes, and my mother saying I didn't think of it as paying. And here's what I know, what I will carry out of this whole story. They didn't disappear me, I appeared. Slowly, 2 miles at a time, one signature at a time, one transfer I didn't send. 1 month's savings that stayed in an account with only my name on it. I appeared in a city I chose, in a life I built, in an apartment on Olive Way with a cable spool table and a jade plant and windows that face east. You cannot miss a person who was never really there. And you cannot claim a person disappeared who was all along, simply learning to take up the right amount of space. That's my story. $14,000, 4 years of a name attached to a lie, and one November evening in the rain when my brother knocked on a door he didn't expect to open the way it did. If you are the reliable one in your family, the one who handles it, the one who sends the transfers, the one whose name becomes a story when you stop, take this with you. Make the spreadsheet. Keep the documentation. Build the life. You are not the family's load-bearing wall. You are a person. And people get to have their own foundation. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling me what finally made you look at the numbers. Subscribe if you're staying. I'll see you in the next.